aliens, and you don't know what it might be. I was so excited. I ran inside. Mom and Dad, you got to come see this. Dragged them out in the snow so they could see it too. And discovering Saturn by accident was thrilling for me, and had forgotten to tether down the $5 million tool bag, and it escaped from her grasp. And so I saw the tool bag following the space station across the sky. And right now I'm retired from my day job and basically doing full-time astronomy outreach and education and astrophotography. I'm a NASA Solar System Ambassador.
Welcome back on the SpaceInfo podcast. Here we talk about space and everything related to it. If you're passionate about space, astronomy, technology, and everything about it, you can join all our social platforms at the SpaceInfo Club or our website at www.spaceinfo.club, where tons of content and a community of experts are there waiting for you. This is the SpaceInfo Club. Hello Mark, how are you? Today we talk about astronomy. How are you?
I'm well, thank you very much. It's nice to be on the program.
Tell us what are you doing now? What's your main activity?
All right, okay. So hello everyone, it's Mark Johnston. I'm known on social media as AZ Astro Guy, and I've been interested in astronomy since I was a child. And right now I'm retired from my day job and basically doing full-time astronomy outreach and education and astrophotography. I'm a NASA Solar System Ambassador. I've also got a Exceptional Outreach Award from Night Sky Network, and I have also a number of awards from other groups. I'm the Vice President of the Phoenix Astronomical Society here in Phoenix, Arizona in the USA, and I'm very interested in astronomy and devour all sorts of information on the topic as much as I can. I do about 125 public outreach events every year. I did one last night and the night before. And I really enjoy helping people learn more about the universe.
I think that this is amazing. That's really a huge number of events, so congrats. And okay, so maybe you just want to tell us how your journey began in this field. So what just sparked your interest, your passion in astronomy and astrophotography?
Probably two things. So first of all, when I was 10 or 11 years old, my parents gave me a telescope for Christmas. It was a cheap 60 millimeter Tasco refractor, and I took it out in the snow in the backyard in Ontario, Canada, and didn't really know what I was doing. I saw one particularly bright star, and when I focused on it, I realized I was seeing Saturn with the rings. You could even see the Cassini division in a small telescope and a couple of the moons. And I was so excited. I ran inside. Said, Mom and Dad, you got to come see this. Dragged them out in the snow so they could see it too. And discovering Saturn by accident was thrilling for me. As anyone who's looked through a telescope knows, Saturn is arguably one of the most exciting things you can see visually through a telescope. So I saw that one of the first nights I was out with my telescope. And also later that year, the first Apollo astronauts landed on the moon. And I remember being up at a cottage in Northern Ontario and looking at a little black and white television as a child and seeing Neil Armstrong step down the ladder and make the first steps on the moon, and looking up through the window at the sky and seeing the gibbous moon hanging there and knowing that someone was actually walking there right now was just so impactful to a young child. So those two events, I think, really helped spark an interest for me. I've always been interested in science. I ended up getting a degree in electrical engineering. But in fact, there's a bit of a funny story there. So I thought I would go into astronomy as a career. And I assumed that after I left high school, I would go to university and study astronomy, be an astrophysicist perhaps. And then I looked into it and I found out that if you're doing astronomy, I had visions originally that you're simply looking in the eyepiece through big telescopes and seeing wonderful things in the sky. And I found that the reality was there's a telescope operator who captures the images on a camera, and then he emails you the images and you sit in a cubicle and you do math. And I thought, that's not much fun. That's not what my vision was for astronomy. So instead I went into electrical engineering, which turned out to be all math anyway. So I didn't escape the math. But in any event, I've had many telescopes since then. I currently have 5, and I use them all the time. Last weekend, I was out at one of the best facilities in North America called the Chiricahua Astronomy Complex. It's Bortle 1, which I measured a sky reading of 21.82, which is extremely dark. And I had multiple telescopes set up, and I was imaging objects throughout the night, every night that I was there. So I have a real passion for it, and I enjoy explaining astronomy and answering questions for people. And it's great when people sort of realize that they're looking back in time. When they look up at the sky, I often will point at the middle star in Orion's belt and tell people that light left 2,000 years ago and just got here tonight. And they're all floored at that realization. So that's kind of how I got started and kind of where I am now.
Yeah, so basically, if I'm understanding correctly, besides the result of this activity, what seems to be very important and one of the, let's say, center topic of your activity is basically sharing what you do with other people.
Yes, it is.
And okay, so you mentioned a couple of experiences, I would say, at the beginning of your career, because actually that was what sparked the beginning of your passion. So maybe you'd like to share with us some other experiences, maybe while actually photographing the cosmos.
Well, one of the ones that it wasn't actually photography, but it's a very memorable experience. As you may know, there are plenty of websites and apps that will tell you when the International Space Station is flying over, and it's quite bright and quite obvious. And I wondered whether if I pointed my telescope at the space station, could I actually see the solar panels and the main crew chamber, or would it just be a blob? And so I set up a telescope in the front yard. I knew the ISS would be rising at a certain time. And sure enough, it appeared where I expected it to appear, and I focused on it carefully with my telescope, and I could clearly see the solar panels and the structure. It was very exciting. But then I noticed that light following the space station. So there was a bright light of the space station with the structure of the solar panels and so on. And then right behind it, a little faint light following behind. And at first I thought, is there perhaps a reflection in the optics? Is there some sort of problem with my system? But I had a very high-end apochromatic refractor telescope. It was no issue there at all. It was actually a real object following the space station, something very small, but it was there and I could see it. And I followed it all the way across the sky. It trailed right behind the space station all the way across the sky. And then eventually the space station flew into the Earth's shadow and it disappeared. And I thought, what could that be? And of course, you're thinking, aliens, and you don't know what it might be. And I went to bed that night. I was completely puzzled. In the morning, I woke up and I checked my space news. And it turned out that one of the astronauts on the space station had been out doing some servicing of the space station outside the space station and had forgotten to tether down the $5 million tool bag, and it escaped from her grasp. And so I saw the tool bag following the space station across the sky.
Wow.
And it has since burned up in the atmosphere, of course, but that was sort of a fun thing to see.
Yeah. Probably you were just looking, I would say, in a third perspective of the thing. We just can imagine what the astronaut could have imagined while seeing that bag of, I would say, falling down to the planet in that moment.
Yes. So that was a fun memory.
For sure, I can bet on it. And yeah, also at the beginning, you mentioned your, I would say, very active role as ambassador. And so maybe there are different sides of one thing. You mentioned with the astronomy, you imagine it as just pure observation, and then turn it out with also maths involved, a lot of calculation. So probably you'd like to share some responsibility that you have as an ambassador, and how does it complement your work as an astrophotographer?
So solar system ambassadors are appointed once a year by NASA, and you have to be a U.S. citizen to be a NASA solar system ambassador. You apply in September, and they review the applications throughout the fall, and you're told in January whether you pass or not. And as a solar system ambassador, you're required to do at least 4 public outreach events and report on them back to NASA as far as what you did and what you talked about and who you saw and any photographs and so on. And as I mentioned earlier, I did about 125, so I met the criteria. So basically what I do is I assist NASA with astronomy and space science related education and outreach. So I can talk about current missions like the Parker Space Probe going to the sun, or past probes like the Kepler mission and Cassini and Juno and things like that. So I seek to educate and inspire the next generation of scientists and engineers. So I'll do a lot of public events at schools, at public parks, libraries, and I also do corporate events at hotels and resorts. And in many of these events, I'm doing EAA, which is electronically assisted astronomy, where you have a camera attached to the telescope, and the camera connects to a laptop, which then goes to a television. And so people can stand and look at the TV, and everyone can see the image at the same time. So, for example, last night at the Four Seasons Resort, I was doing an EAA presentation, and I was showing the twin galaxies in Ursa Major, M81 and M82. And as we looked at the galaxies, as more and more light came in from the camera, you could see the spiral arms appearing and the structure in M81, a little red area in the middle of M82, the cigar galaxy, and see more and more and more detail being revealed the longer you stay on it through what's called live stacking. So this technique is in many ways preferred over looking through an eyepiece, because you can see more detail in events, you can see color in objects. If I was to show, for example, the Whirlpool galaxy to someone in a telescope, especially if you're in the suburbs of a city, all you're likely to see is maybe 2 little nucleuses, the 2 nuclei of the 2 galaxies, 2 little faint smudges. But yet with my EAA approach, I can show you the full spiral arm. I can show you the light bridge connecting the big galaxy to the small galaxy and all the detail there. So it also means people can see the same thing at the same time. There's no lineups. And if people have glasses, there's no worry about taking glasses on or glasses off. It's good for people who are in a wheelchair or they're very young. Everyone can see a television. There's no need to worry about trying to look into an eyepiece. So that's pretty much how I do most of my public events now, and it's worked out very well.
Yeah, as I said before, I think that this is the spirit of sharing and letting people know what you do, and also being able to, as you said, seeing the results of what an observation is. I think that this is amazing. So also due to this, I think that a lot of people can be amazed and maybe are aspiring to become a astrophotographer. So maybe you have some piece of advice that you'd like to tell them, to tell us basically, and maybe also mentioning some challenges. So on one side, some advices, maybe some challenges that come from your experiences, as you were mentioning, capturing some celestial objects. Maybe you have some advices in that sense.
Sure. Well, it's really a great time to get into astrophotography because there are so many terrific resources, and also the technology's improved so much. So the first thing I would suggest is YouTube is a tremendous resource for learning about astrophotography. There are at least a dozen really competent astrophotography experts that publish regularly and have big followings. And I think that the first thing to do is to decide what you're most interested in. So, for example, solar photography is completely different from planetary photography, which in turn is completely different from deep space target photography. So if you want to shoot a galaxy, it's a very different process than shooting Jupiter or the moon or the sun. So the first thing to do is kind of decide what you're most interested in, because that will take you in a different path. And you also should think about whether there's an alignment between your location. For example, it's difficult but not impossible to image a faint galaxy from the city. That's pretty challenging. And your budget and your time. How much time do you have? Is it okay for you to stay up late? Would you rather do things yourself and monitor them, or set things up to work automatically? So you can invest in tools that will be automated and can turn the telescope on at a certain time of night when it's dark and take the images and then turn it off again while you're still sleeping. That takes a little more effort, but there are a lot of tools now that make this automation much easier than it was in the old days. So you can take a terrific photograph of the moon in a few seconds, but you should expect to spend hours and hours of data if you want to get a good image of a nebula or a galaxy.
Yeah, so one of the thing that just hit me while you were talking is the fact that you can set your basically your rig while you're you say while you're sleeping. So this kind of automation, I think that is amazing. I don't know if just probably on my side, what I'm thinking that that's not really the spirit of the observation. Just getting down in the cold, spending the time waiting for the result. Maybe it's different. Maybe it's also different from when you began your journey, I would say.
Yeah. So, and there are other ways too. Like there's a company called Telescope Live, where you can get a subscription, and then you can download images taken by their telescopes from observatories around the world and just learn how to process them. So you take the raw data and you create the picture from their raw data. But when I was starting off, I had you have to picture this. I had a big table and I had these laminated sheets about this big of star charts, about 24 of them for the Northern Hemisphere. And I would look up in my binoculars and see a bright star and I'd say, okay, the object I'm looking for is about 5 degrees to the southwest. So I'd find the chart that had the big star on it, and I'd star hop to another star, look back at the chart, look back in the binoculars, move the telescope a little bit, and I'd repeat this process 5 or 6 times to find, the globular cluster or the galaxy that I was looking for. And it took a tremendous amount of time. It was very satisfying, but it forced you to learn a lot more about the sky. But now, of course, with most of the mounts we have, the mounts have these go-to functions in them, and you simply tell it once the telescope is aligned to, go to the Ring Nebula, and the telescope points right at it, and it's centered. So it's a lot easier now than it was in the old days.
Yeah, and while you were talking, I can just imagine that the same time you spent just telling this sentence, it probably I think that same time that the telescope needs to align with the object you want to observe, and just I can only imagine the fact that you are I would say looking at a chart, a paper chart, and then you try to align and point your telescope, and then you probably need to wait some time to get the object you're hoping to observe to appear. But maybe if you're not correctly aligned, it doesn't simply appear. So you just need to reattempt and spend a lot of more time. So yeah, I think that this factor is really amazing and just gives an idea of how much technology is helping out today.
Yeah, there's still a lot of challenges when you're trying to capture an object in the sky. Like, for example, an obvious one is clouds. So if it's cloudy, you can't do any astrophotography. Mm-hmm. But sometimes you have days where it's sort of cloudy, sort of sunny, and the weather forecast is sort of nebulous, a little dubious. And for a lot of us who live near cities, you need to get away from the city light if you want to get good images of what are called broadband targets like galaxies and globular clusters and star clusters and things like that. Nebula tend to be more forgiving. You can use filters from the city and get good pictures of them, but it's harder, not impossible, but harder to get good images of broadband targets unless you get away from the city light. So if I'm thinking about, do I want to take an hour and a half drive away from the city and go out to the desert or the mountains where it's dark, I don't want to go all the way out there and have it be cloudy. So there are a number of apps you can get now for your phone and of course on the web that will predict what the cloud cover is going to be by the hour for your location. And what I do, I have about 8 of these, and I will look at all 8 of them and take the average and see, because that usually gives you a good sense of what's going to happen. And if they don't all, if let's say 6 out of 8 are calling for mostly clear skies, then I won't go, because I've had times where I've driven a long way and then it ended up being cloudy. For some types of objects, the seeing is important, and seeing is an astronomical term that describes how turbulent the air is. So you could have a clear sky and think it's terrific to look at planets or the sun, but these objects are very susceptible to air currents causing distortions and giving you a difficult time getting good pictures of them. So similarly, there are other apps that tell you about the seeing predictions, ones like Astrospheric and Meteo Blue, and a few other ones. And they help you predict whether you can get a good photograph of the sun with the solar telescope or planets, for example. There's a lot of advancement that we've seen in this area. I mentioned already the go-to mounts. We used to be, if you had an equatorial mount, you had to align it on Polaris, on the North Star, if you're in the Northern Hemisphere. And that was a complicated process. It required looking through a little reticule and rotating it and making adjustments with thumb wheels. And now this is all very automated with the new mounts that are out there now. We have much better filters that can filter out city lights, especially for nebula, than we had in the past. We have autofocusers. You can simply tell the telescope, go get focused, and it will focus itself over 2 or 3 minutes, and you have a pinpoint sharp focus. And you have adapters that can reduce the focal ratio. So take a telescope that's nominally, say, an f7 and turn it into an f4.5, or a Schmidt-Cassegrain telescope that's an f10 and make it an f2, which gives you much more light gathering much faster. And it makes it easier to find, align, and stay focused on a target. So all these things make it much easier now than it was in the past to get a really good picture of something in the sky.
Yeah, and just to get a little back on what you mentioned about taking photograph from, I would say, the surface of the planet. You have an atmosphere, and just to point out the fact for people who are listening, that's only one of the many reasons why we have a space telescope. Basically, one of the advantages of being out of the atmosphere. Okay, probably some telescope also just exploit the presence of, for example, the moon to get the right light to be shielded from radiation and other things. But one of the point is getting out from the atmosphere, because it is just like a filter. And but not, I would say, not a good one, useful for the photography. Most of the cases just the disturbances, and you can only get rid of it just by getting out of the atmosphere itself. So that's one of the point why space telescopes are so important for the people who didn't know. And I see on your approach, you say that you don't really like maths, or at least you didn't really like it at the beginning in this field. But I see that you have a really, I would say, engineeristic approach to what you do. You're really schematic. Really, you just get a lot of data before acting. I don't know if these are probably comes from your experience, but also from the will of optimizing what you're doing, probably.
Yeah.
Okay, so on this side, there is this approach, but a lot of people, when look at your photographs, probably are just amazed from what they are seeing. So there is a sort of, I would say, artistic side in it. So probably you are also trying to balance these two aspects while during your activity, I mean.
Yeah. So you're right. There's a lot of things that have to go right to get a good picture of, say, a galaxy. You have to have a stable mount, good guiding, consistent focus, the right exposure, correct binning. All these things have to be correct. And then you finally get an image, but that alone doesn't mean it's going to be a great picture. So some of the artistic aspects include, framing, for example. So is the object crowded in the field with not much space around it? So for example, last weekend when I was at the Chiricahua Astronomy Complex, I took a wide field photograph of the Crescent Nebula, which is NGC 6888 in Cygnus. And my first thought was I'd center it in the field. And then I realized that on one side, there was a very large nebula complex near the star Satyr, SADR, which is the central star in the cross of Cygnus. And I could frame the picture such that I could get all that nebulosity on one side and the Crescent Nebula on the other side. And I found that framing made it much more pleasing to look at. So another example would be if you want to take a picture of the Sombrero Galaxy, which is M104, there's a really interesting star cluster nearby called the Stargate cluster, which is a triangle of stars inside a triangle of stars. and you can adjust the photograph so you can capture both the galaxy and the star cluster in the same field, which makes it very, very interesting. So part of it is framing, as I say. Part of it is, do you want to add more color? Some people take this overboard. I've seen some very garish purple galaxies that are not realistic, and also some impossibly vivid nebula colors that look very artificial. I think adding some saturation and hue adjustment can be a nice artistic touch, but you have to be careful that you don't overdo it. Similarly, you can try to sharpen an image, and if you over sharpen it, the image starts to look very unnatural. So it's tempting with some of the software tools that are out there to try and push things pretty far, but you have to know when to kind of dial it back a bit and make it look a little more natural. But there's a balance between, I think it's okay. I'm not doing necessarily, research for a professional university. So I'm just making a nice picture I want to post on social media. So I don't think there's anything wrong with adding a little bit of saturation, maybe a little bit of a hue adjustment, adjusting contrast a bit to make it look good. And I think that's kind of appropriate for the kind of level that I'm at.
Yeah, particularly on this last point, I think that, again, for some people, maybe it's proper to make out some differences. As you mentioned, you said you're not making particular research, for example, for university, for research itself. So by observing different wavelengths, people in general add some color, but there is no I would say visible correspondence between the color you've been adding to a photograph, for example, to an observation, because you're probably, I would say, you're observing a phenomenon or a galaxy or something, for example, in infrared or in ultraviolet wavelengths. So you're just adding a color code to recognize different wavelengths, but that they are usually not they are actually not visible to you. What you were saying, if I understanding correctly, you're trying to balance the color to make it to make a better photo. So that's something that I really like it, because you're just melting different aspects, and you're just trying to take the best shot for people to like it. If I'm understanding correctly, is that the right approach? That's right. Okay, and I really love it. So you mentioned some photographs, some I would say. Angles of the sky you have been taking, but is there any project or any particular, I would say, maybe expedition you are really excited about your journey?
Yes, well, it turns out that exactly 1 month from today, I'm going to be in the African country of Namibia, which is south of the equator. And there's a astro camp you can go to where you are able to reserve in advance telescopes that are already mounted on mounts. So a friend and I are going to bring some cameras and ASI air controllers and cables and a few other things. And we already have a list of southern hemisphere targets that are impossible to see from North America, from anywhere north of the equator, basically. And in Arizona, I'm fortunate that we are far enough south that I can barely image some objects like Centaurus A radio galaxy or the Omega Centauri globular cluster. In fact, I saw that last night, but it's very, very low, only about 5 degrees above the southern horizon. So it's very low in the sky. But from Namibia, these things will be overhead. I'll be able to see the center of the Milky Way directly at the zenith, which I've never seen, from here, at least with a telescope. And so the other advantage to that time of year is that in the southern hemisphere, in June, it's winter. And it'll be the longest nights of the year. So we're going to have about 12 to 13 hours of darkness with lots of time to image objects. So we're going to be there for about 4 nights, and we're excited to get hopefully some images of things that we've never been able to capture before. So that's one project that we're excited about. And then anyone who's kind of followed me or looked into my YouTube channel or my images knows that I do a great deal of solar imaging. And I have a very good Lunt 100 millimeter double stacked refractor telescope. And I'm looking at making a modification to my Tech 160 refractor to turn it into a hydrogen alpha telescope. So we'll see how that goes. Some of the parts I have are very long lead time, so I can't go into too much detail right now, but it's going to be kind of a custom project. And if it all works well, I should be able to get some very high resolution images of the sun, especially of things like sunspots and prominences and filaments in the months to come once I get all these parts together and assembled.
Maybe you'd like to mention something that's special on your activity, some subject you consider special for you.
Well, in all the things that we're talking about imaging at the moment and not just on public outreach, which I enjoy tremendously. But as far as when I'm alone and I'm taking pictures, probably the favorite thing that I like to look at is the sun. And of course, I should make the obligatory comment, you only want to look at the sun if you have proper solar telescope or proper filters that can make it safe to do so. It's very easy to get blinded looking at the sun if you have the improper equipment. But assuming you've got the right gear, the sun is the only target in the sky that is completely different every day you look at it. So every day there's new prominences on the limb, there are new filaments, there's new active regions, sunspots are moving across the surface, and so you're seeing a new picture all the time. And especially now that we're approaching solar maximum in late 2024, we're seeing a lot of activity on the sun. It makes it really interesting. I took a picture this morning of a gigantic prominence on the sun that was not there yesterday. So the sun is really interesting to look at, plus you don't lose any sleep doing the sun, whereas most other things you look at, you have to stay up late to get pictures of them, and that can, unless you've got it all automated, can interfere with your sleep patterns. The sun you can do during the day. So probably the sun is my favorite thing to look at. But other than that, I do enjoy the brighter nebula, like the Helix Nebula, the North American Nebula. And I really like the look of the spiral galaxies like the Whirlpool Galaxy and the Pinwheel Galaxy. Those are fun. Those are ones that I think the public, when I'm doing an EAA presentation, appreciate the most as well.
Yeah, and I think that we all can appreciate it, them on your Instagram feed. They're amazing photo.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm just posting some now from my last trip to the Chiricahua complex, and over the next 4 or 5 days, I'll be posting new photographs I've taken from that weekend. That was very productive down there.
Yeah, actually, I'm sharing your YouTube channel also on the video, so people who are looking for a AZ Astro Guy can find you on YouTube and also on Instagram, where I first found you. And you have a lot of amazing images, so I really invite people to go and look for your channel or your content, because that's really amazing, and that's really a pleasure. And so probably people will be inspired by these images, as I am actually. And so what do you think is the role of astrophotography in making this, in building this inspiration to people, and I would say building the wheel to understand how the universe works actually?
Well, I think learning astrophotography forces you to understand more about the night sky. It's a challenge. There's a lot to understand. You have to have, as I mentioned earlier, everything has to go right. You have to have a stable mount, and you have to have a good telescope, and you have to be in focus, and you have to be guiding properly and tracking on the target. And sometimes you might have to use a filter, and you have to get enough light, and you have to get enough subs of these light, the number of pictures you can combine. Then there's the whole post-processing aspect. But as you're doing that, you tend to get a sense of how insignificant our sun, our star, is with respect to the entire Milky Way. So our galaxy, the Milky Way, has got perhaps 400 billion stars, our sun of which is just one of those 400 billion stars. And when you look at an object in your telescope and you're capturing data with your camera, and you see these countless stars in the background of whatever picture you're looking at, whether it's a nebula or a galaxy or a star cluster or a binary star or something, you're going to see all kinds of stars in the background. You realize just how insignificant our sun is with respect to the Milky Way. And then you turn your telescope to look at the constellation of Virgo, and you see hundreds of galaxies in one field in Virgo, for example. And you understand, the Hubble Deep Field told us that there are perhaps 2 trillion galaxies in our universe, in the observable universe. So if our Milky Way is in fact only one of 2 trillion galaxies, that makes our whole galaxy fairly insignificant. And then that's just kind of a size thinking. If you think about time, the average existence for any one of us will span perhaps 100 years if we're lucky. And the universe is many billions of years old. So we're only looking at one very tiny slice of time in the immense, vast length of the time the universe has been around and will, of course, go into the future. So for me, understanding how lucky we are to understand what we see out there and our place in the cosmos being so small and so insignificant, it keeps you humble. I think it helps with perspective. Somebody cuts you off on the highway with their car, and I think, well, in a billion years it won't matter, and we're just one little planet going around one star, 400 billion in one of 2 trillion galaxies. It's really not meant to really matter, and so I find that it sort of helps me keep my balance with life in general.
Yeah, that's a really a good perspective to take when looking at life. And okay, so I think I just have to thank you for the great interview. That was a real pleasure for me. And I remember again your contact on the socials, which is AZ Astro Guy. And okay, people, so just give a look to these images because they're amazing. So thank you, Mark, for being here.
Well, thanks very much for having me on. I enjoyed it.
So see you next time. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.